All right, welcome back. Now this is going to be the first video of chapter 13. So you can see I didn't write anything on the board. In this video, I wanted to actually just make an intro video to chapter 13. I didn't feel the need to do that for a lot of the other chapters, but I kind of felt like I should for this chapter. So I just kind of want to make an introduction for the chapter about what to expect and kind of a little bit about what we're going to go over. So, in this chapter, like I said before, we're going to now start talking about, we're now going to move away from emotions, and we're now going to talk more about charging the subconscious for the purpose of performance, right? So we're now going to, and that's actually going to incorporate the other transcendental mental abilities, which we haven't really talked too much about. So we're going to now talk about transcendental belief, transcendental control, and transcendental creativity. Transcendental imagination or altered perception. We did, that kind of was alluded to when we talked about emotion. We're going to talk a little bit about that in this chapter too, but more so we're going to talk about it in the context. Because imagination you get with everything, right? So but we're going to talk more about the other ones in this chapter. Now, as you're going to see, charging for the purpose of generally charging belief or control or creativity is going to be more useful for charging in the context of performance, right? So you're trying to perform well at something, right? When it comes to emotions, you're not really trying to perform well. You just want to feel more emotion, right? So that dynamic, the dynamic between the two is useful to make, right? Or the difference between the two is useful to acknowledge because the way you charge your subconscious is actually different, right? Between the two. This was something I learned, right? So it took me a long time to learn that, but eventually I began to understand that about the subconscious. And so in this chapter, to talk about charging for the purpose of performance, we're going to now start talking about a new type of, or a new formalism, right? That I call, that I refer to by the term subconscious paths, right? Or path formalisms, right? And when we talk about path formalisms, we're going to talk about the subconscious, specifically subconscious memory, but we're going to talk about it more from the context, or we're going to establish certain geometrical principles, right? So I know that sounds kind of weird because the subconscious is abstract, right? It's just something supernatural or metaphysical, but it actually is possible to establish geometrical principles in the subconscious mind. We talked slightly about certain geometrical principles when we talked about the concept of subject closeness, right? Because we had to pretty much imagine the idea of a subject space and the idea of a metric. We defined a metric on that space, which is similar to Euclidean space, and defining a metric on Euclidean space, which is usually based on Pythagoras' theorem, something like that. But so we did a tiny bit of that, but we're going to do it a little bit more in this chapter. We also talked a tiny bit about path formalism in chapter 12 when we talked about not statements and dissonance, but for the most part, you can get away without using path formalism when talking about emotions, which is why I haven't brought it up too much. But path formalism is actually the more complete, it's the more complete view of what's going on with the subconscious mind when it's charging. Like I said, we can get away without talking about it for emotions, but you can't really do that when talking about performance. You have to acknowledge the much more complete scope of what's happening. So we've actually, so far, we've actually been talking about subconscious charging from a less complete view or perspective, right? So now we're going to go to the much more complete view, which tends to be a little more complicated, right? So I like to kind of think of it similar to the difference between special relativity and general relativity, right? So if you're not familiar with this stuff, if you're in physics, then you know what I'm talking about. But special relativity is basically the study of the consequences. You could say the study of physics or the physical consequences of the fact that the laws of physics are the same in every reference frame. Specifically, the fact that the speed of light is the same, right? So before Einstein created special relativity, I believe, and I could be wrong about this, but if memory serves me, the general presumption of the laws of physics in terms of how they would be observed from different reference frames or changing the values of the physics laws of physics, or what's measured in one reference frame to another, was basically done according to Galileo, or it's referred to as Galilean relativity. And basically, if something's moving, let's say at velocity v, right? If something's moving at a velocity v, and that thing, let's say it's a person, and that person throws a ball, then the ball would just be moving at some velocity, which would be velocity v plus some other velocity, v plus something else, some positive number, and that's how it would appear relative to me. However, or relative to a still reference frame or a different observer, right? But Einstein said that no, that's not correct, which actually is a consequence of Maxwell's equations, which people didn't really know that at first. They realized, I don't know the exact story of how Einstein discovered this, but there was a book I was reading on it. If you look at Maxwell's equations, it makes a reference to the speed of light without any other variables, right? So it's just a fact of nature that electromagnetic waves will always move at the speed of light. And so Einstein basically expanded that to say that is always true. Nothing can exceed the speed of light. So it's an axiom, right? Or postulate. And he basically realized all of the consequences of that fact being true, and that's the study of special relativity. However, special relativity doesn't account for changing or accelerating reference frames, right? So the laws that he talks about in the Lorentz transformations, they only make sense if you're talking about reference frames that have constant velocity. So either they're completely at rest or they're moving with constant velocity. They're not accelerating. Now, general relativity talks about accelerating reference frames. So it talks a lot about gravity, because gravity causes acceleration and gravity is everywhere. And so to talk about accelerating reference frames, you have to expand the scope of what special relativity talks about. So when you expand it, and I haven't studied, I've looked up general relativity, I've looked up videos on it to get a general idea of it, but I haven't studied general relativity as a complete course yet, which is terrible, right? So I feel like I obviously should have studied that by now, but I've just been too busy. But at least I had enough respect for myself to study special relativity. So I just study it like online at the MIT online videos, which are really good. I think the guy's name is Leonard Susskind or something like that. But not that matters, but those are kind of just things I look up. But in general relativity, the much more complete view of the principles that Einstein talks about in special relativity, they have to start talking about curvature, and they talk about geodesics, which are kind of like, I believe, curved lines. So when you zoom in to a geodesic, or the curved line on a sphere, for example, it looks straight, right? In that straight, that kind of straight line or straight kind of space-time is generally how you would study special relativity. You would talk about the laws of special relativity. But the moment it curves, right, now you have to expand into general relativity. And general relativity, my understanding is much more complicated, and you have to use tensors to sort of preserve certain lengths of, I would imagine them to be vectors. You have to preserve the length of vectors using a metric tensor in different reference frames. Like I said, I haven't looked it up yet. That's my understanding of what a metric tensor is. It preserves the length of some vector when you change reference frames. So of course, you're most likely going to use that in general relativity. The physicists will fact check me if I'm wrong. But my point is, which I kind of went on a tangent there, but my point is that general relativity is the much larger scope of what's happening. You can kind of ignore it when you're talking about a lot of its principles when you're talking about special relativity, because you're not dealing with an accelerated reference frame. In this case, right, we can ignore a lot of the principles of path formalism when we're just talking about emotions. But when you expand to talking about performance, now you have to include those principles. So I say all that to say that this chapter, in my opinion, is probably going to be the most theoretically intense chapter, or the most theory-intense chapter in the book, probably of the two books, right? Book 2 is probably not going to be that theory-intense, because Book 2, we just talk about we talk about metaphysical things. So we talk about a lot of spiritual stuff and metaphysical phenomena. And that's just based on these principles. So it's probably going to be a lot easier to understand. chapter 10 in book 2, which really should have been multiple chapters, but I just didn't feel like making more. I was so done with writing those books, or writing the book. But that's probably the only one that comes a little close. But I would say this chapter is going to be the most intense of the 2 chapters. Now, like I said before, I didn't learn, no one taught me any of this, so I didn't learn this in anywhere near the order that I'm teaching you. I just kind of thought this was the best order to teach it. So I don't know what it's like to learn these principles in the order that I'm teaching it to you. Maybe it'll be easy for you to understand. This took me a long time to understand. So like I said before, the last thing I kind of understood about charging was the subconscious burst action. But before that, it was this, right? So this was one of the very last things I understood. And when I first started learning how to charge in my subconscious, right? Now, interestingly enough, the very first time I kind of got an idea of the subconscious even existed, anywhere near the way I've understand it to exist now, was actually when I was much younger. I was in my early 20s, right? And I kept entering the zone. Now, I've always been a kind of theory junkie, right? So I've always been doing theory since I was a kid. So when I would enter the zone, I'm still kind of creating theory in my mind about what's happening. And that's when I first came up with the concept of the subconscious mind, being, looking something like what I perceive it to be now. But then I stopped doing it for years, right? And then later, when I was roughly, I believe 29 or 30, I got back into it. But I started charging emotion, right? So eventually, that's when I really got into it. So that was years ago. And when I started to get the hang of charging emotion, I understood that same part of my mind, which was the subconscious, was also responsible for transcendental performance. Now, I didn't call it that at the time, right? But I knew it was responsible for that state where my performance is very enhanced, which at the time I just called it a flow state, or a state of flow, which other people refer to it that sometimes by that term too. But when I started to recognize that came from the subconscious, I didn't know how to charge my subconscious for that. Eventually, I could do it pretty easily for emotions, and I got better and better at it. But emotions were never really that hard, right? It was, at least compared to this. Charging my subconscious for performance was much harder, and I just couldn't understand how to do it. I could pull it off, but it always felt it was always very difficult for me to do it. It always felt very inefficient. I felt like I was giving a lot of wasted effort. And so that told me I didn't fully understand it. So I kept trying to understand it more and more and more. And as I developed the theory more, and as I started to have more of the tools to sort of model the subconscious properly, eventually I developed the tools that we're going to talk about in this chapter, which is path formalism. And then once I had that, I felt like I could understand everything, right, about transcendental performance, right? So I just want to give that heads up, basically to say that, this chapter is probably going to be very complicated or very intense. And maybe some people won't find it complicated at all, which is good. But I feel like probably it is, especially if you're not used to theory or abstraction or heavy amounts of philosophy and things like that. You might find it a little tough. But, if you're someone who's interested in transcendental performance or trying to perform well at things, so it doesn't matter what it is, right? So if you're any kind of performer at all. If you're an athlete and you want to perform well at sports, if you're a singer and you want to perform well at singing, if you just want to perform well in everyday circumstances, right? If you want to walk around with more confidence, if you want to be more, I used it for to be a better conversationalist. If you want to be good at conversation or be funny, right? Make music. It doesn't matter, right? Even changing your personality to have a certain type of personality. Let's say you want to feel more like Superman, right? You want to have more of the character of Superman. You can even do that. That's a transcendental performance charge. That's actually what actors do when they use method acting, where you actually talk about the principles underlying what they're doing, which is really just a transcendental performance charge. It's no different than anything. Charging your subconscious to perform well in anything else, and you can use it to charge almost like a character if you want to be like a certain person. That's why you notice people will have almost different personalities sometimes. It's because they're doing something like a character charge. But we'll talk more about that later. But if you're interested in any of those things, then these principles are going to help you do those. Now, if you're not that interested in it, I still recommend to, make an effort to understand the chapter and the theory, even if it's tough. But we won't really need these principles too much for the rest of what we talk about in book 2, because we're almost there. These principles, you can get away with not really understanding them for the other stuff. It's still good to know it, but you can get away without understanding it. But for performance, you absolutely have to understand these principles. You're not going to be able to charge your subconscious for performance or creativity or any of that stuff just using the principles we talked about before, which is not using path formulas. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Just wanted to give this little intro chapter. I thought it, would be useful because, like I said, it's very theory intense, and the only reason I came to think in these super highly theory intense ways is because I kept trying to understand how the subconscious charges for performance, and that led me to these ideas. Right? In the next chapter, we're kind of going to kick things off by talking about what I call the drop-off problem. So we're going to talk about why everything we talked about so far for emotion doesn't really work for performance. And that basically starts with what I call the drop-off problem. Right? So yeah, that's it for now, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.